So, my mom remembers this just briefly, and I do apologize of the fact that it's not really as long as you may expect it to be. But this is actually one of the stories that happened to my mom sometime in the mid 2000s. Since I was a young kid at the time, I can't exactly remember what date or, in this case, what year it was. Let's just say it was around the mid 2000s. My mom and I used to go to this one public library in my hometown. It was a very decent sized library, but it was much bigger the more you walk in and see more things. It was a pretty big public library. The type of library that have, movie rentals. That's the kind of library I'm talking about. My mom used to rent movies when I was a kid, mainly like anything from Arthur and Spot to DC and even other superhero related stuff such as Teen Titans and etc. However, one story really stood out the most. My mom and I went to the library with my brother and a couple of our friends. When I mean by a couple of friends is my mom's friends who lived next door to her. They had a kid too. So my mom and her friend were going down to one of the adult areas, you know, books that were more for grown-ups, such as romance and fanfic, fan novels, and etc. Now, as my mom and her friend were there, I was at the kids area with another of our friend who happened to be with them at the time. Probably my neighbor's aunt or something. I honestly don't remember. My mom and her friend were in what seemed to be the romance section of the library. My mom was checking out one of the books when all of a sudden she heard tapping. She honestly looked up thinking that maybe someone was tapping being from around her, but she couldn't see anyone. She was the only one in one of the aisles of the book section, which happened to be the romance novels. She called out if anyone was there as quietly as she can, as the library most of the time had to be quiet. Unfortunately, no one was around. She was picking out a few of the books to rent or borrow when she heard the tapping again. She this time saw no one there, so she walked up and down the aisles just to make sure no one else was around and making the tapping noises. However, when my mom looked around, she couldn't find anybody, and this was honestly really freaky, as who was making the tapping noises? She ended up going to one of the librarians who checked out the area, but they couldn't find anything. Still to this day, my mom's honestly confused as to who or what was there, or who or what was making the tapping noises. However, all mom can think about to this day was whatever happened on that day was completely paranormal. Now, this happened to one of my neighbors who used to live in the same hometown as me until she moved in 2014. Her name was Andrea, and she used to work in the library in 2012. This is one of the greatest jobs that she ever had. She got to work with kids for story time and even helped check in and out books, and even did her duties by making sure all the books were in the right places, clean up certain areas if someone left certain books everywhere, and etc. Andrea was very proud of this job, and even though she was well in her 30s, she had kids of her own. However, this happened sometime in the summer of 2012, shortly after she came back from her 2-week trip to Florida. When she arrived at the library on her first day back at work, her duty was to do a story time for the kids. She honestly loved doing story time with the kids, so she honestly decided to read a Franklin book. I can't honestly remember what Franklin book it was, but I'm assuming it had to do something with the summertime or something like that. I can't honestly remember. But when Andrea did that story time, she offered the kids to read one of the Franklin books in the library and feel free to check them out. All the other parents were there. However, there was someone that had what seemed to be a camera. He obviously was taking pictures, but the flash was on, and Andrea at first didn't notice him. She would tell him to not take pictures, but since it was from his phone, she thought that maybe he had a kid with him, so maybe that might have been it. As Andrea did her usual duties, she ended up looking over to see that man again. He was taking photos of some of the kids that were picking out books and that. Andrea had thought first that maybe this was not the best time to get involved, but however, one of the parents noticed this man, and apparently she had no idea who this man was. She didn't even recognize who he was, and even had no idea on who he is, because this was the first time she's seen him in a library. Till one of the parents said, "Hey, what the hell are you doing? Taking a picture of my kid?" One of the parents came up and snatched the phone away from this guy, which of course, he didn't fight back, but a couple of the other librarians confiscated his phone, and which they called in security. When the security team viewed all the footage of it, I decided not to get involved because it wasn't really my business, but however, I was hearing all the whole convo and kind of peeked at it a little bit. Well, mainly Andrea was, but that's how she said it to me. When she ended up going back to work the next day, of course the police were there and said that there was a child predator there the day she came back to work. They showed her the confiscated phone, which had pictures of children zooming in on their faces and other areas. This obviously really sickened Andrea. A child predator was in the library, but how did she not even know it was that guy? She first thought that it might have been one of the parents of one of the kids, as she's never seen them. Andrea never saw that man again, and thankfully he had been arrested and sent to jail a while later. She quit working the job as a librarian after that incident, mainly because it gave her a really bad vibe, so to which she ended up quitting the library as a librarian job. However, she did enjoy working with the kids, so she later became a teacher, to which it was a really great opportunity for her. However, she always thinks about this time every now and then of what could have happened if no one had said anything about that guy being in the library. That still questions her to this day. And even though she doesn't think about it so much anymore, it still questions her to the very core. This happened sometime in 2016, and it was a day after my 18th birthday. However, this didn't really happen to me in the library, but I somewhat had a part in it. Now, one of my friends, which her name was Mackenzie, she and I got along just fine, and we went to the library to use the computers. Now, it was a pretty neat computer area. So when we went to the library, we got on one of the computers and started playing some games. I was on a couple of games related to horses while Mackenzie was watching a few videos on YouTube and whatnot. However, as I was gaming, I noticed that there was a USB drive or something. It was at least not far from my computer. I picked it up and asked Mackenzie on what it was, and she said she wasn't sure. But since she was pretty much a curious one and knew a lot about computers, she took the USB and said that when she got home, she'll be able to look through it. However, that was not the worst part. The worst part comes after later. We were hesitant to check out what's in the USB drive in the library, because if it did contain some X-rated stuff or something illegal, we obviously would get into a lot of trouble with the librarians and security and etc. So, however, Mackenzie went home that day and she ended up putting the USB drive through her computer to see what it was. Eventually, the computer popped up with a file that said stuff. This honestly confused Mackenzie, so she ended up going through some of it, and when it opened up, she opened up the file to see photos of a lot of women There were some women that were tied up and some women that were doing stuff. It honestly was really weird, as Mackenzie has never seen anything like that. Of course, she went through the other files to see if there were other stuff, but unfortunately, there wasn't really anything else. However, she ended up telling me that she found some illegal stuff. There were a couple of photos, and there were even some videos of women getting killed and murdered on screen and etc. It's honestly very messed up, but there was a lot more USB files that obviously got really messed up. However, this was when Mackenzie turned it into the police, and the police confiscated, but they have no idea on who is the culprit behind the USB. It honestly got really weird. Even though this was from the library, the librarians were contacted by the police, but they had no idea who used the USB last, and they tried asking people if they had it. I don't even know if they caught the culprit behind all of that, but this honestly really still confuses me if that person was still around. I every so fond now again of thinking of that time. I'm glad that Mackenzie was able to respond to the police case at least a month later. Turns out that it sounds like someone was a serial killer and probably kidnapped girls and assaulted them in many ways. But they have no idea if it was the same person that came into the library or it was someone else that had it, just so the real culprit cannot be found. It's honestly still bugs people to this day, and I don't even know what to think of it. About a few, maybe months or so ago, one of my neighbors, which we'll call her Danielle at the time, was at the library. She was taking a few of her, for what seemed to be grandkids there. So, when Danielle took her grandkids, one was about nearly 7 years old and the other one was about 5. She took them to the library to pick out a few books. In the children's area of the library, Danielle was busy looking at her phone while occasionally looking up and checking on the kids. The kids had this story time thing where one of the librarians would read a story. However, as they were doing that, Danielle was looking at the phone when a mysterious man showed up. He seemed to be maybe in his 40s, but he didn't seem like he had any kid with him. In fact, he wasn't with the kid at all, but why was he in an area with the kids in there? He honestly said, "Oh, I see your grandkids. They seem pretty friendly." He seemed to be an okay person, so Danielle thought that, he was okay. But he didn't look like a librarian, though. He looked like he was an old homeless guy, but maybe he was somewhat smart. However, as the storytime thing was done, the kids got their stuff and they ended up going to the checkout, which they check out their books with Danielle following them. However, as they were leaving, the same guy was actually walking with them to the parking lot. Of course, this guy walks up and says, "Hey, I've got candy for your kids if they want any." As soon as that man said that, the kids honestly just stared blankly at them. However, though, they would normally say yes and go with the stranger, but seeing that Danielle was there was no way they would go, as this guy didn't look like he had any candy. Whatever it was, the man just backed away and then went back to his truck and took off. Still to this day, they honestly were glad that Danielle was there to keep the kids safe, because this guy might have had plans to take away the kids, and it wouldn't be really good if he kidnapped them successfully. Now, they have no idea if this guy was ever caught or not, but Danielle would like to think that he had been caught and he had been arrested.